In a world where space and time are intertwined, one man dared to challenge the status quo. His name? Dayton Miller. His weapon of choice, a flute. But not just any flute. This instrument held the power to unleash the ether, a pervasive medium once thought to fill the universe. Miller, a physicist by trade, a musician at heart, discovered a harmonic resonance within the ether. He found that his flute, when played with precision, could manipulate this elusive medium. His melodies, a symphony of science, had the potential to shift the very fabric of reality. However, a sinister force lurked in the shadows. The Einsteinian demons. These creatures thrived in the distortion of space-time, causing chaos and disruption. The world needed a hero, and Miller was ready to answer the call. With his flute,
just logical inference.
All right. Hello and welcome to Aether Cosmology, episode 65. 65 roundtables, lads, and happy New Year's. Today is New Year's Eve, so we're going to get into a presentation by our boy Gregory here. He's going to be teaching us what he knows about logic and debate tactics. So Gregory, if you want to introduce yourself or real quick, tell us who you are and how you came about this conversation and your interest in it, and then we can go from there.
Well, hello, I'm Gregory Greenberg II. I do emphasize that as my father has my same name. There's a slight difference between our middle name and I have a suffix, so it doesn't matter. And I've been interested in philosophy, including logic, for about several years now, 4 years. Right.
Keep asking about
And this also includes cosmology. Categorically, cosmology is a metaphysical concern, and metaphysics is a subcategory of philosophy. And philosophy is not just idle speculation or just running your mouth with big words. No, philosophy is the area of knowledge that is fundamental to and necessarily presupposed by every other delineated area of knowledge. Philosophy asks questions such as, what is real? What is reality? How do you know what you know? What is knowledge? How do you think correct? What is an incorrect line of inference? How should we behave? How should we speak? So in the order that I said those questions, I just meant metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Those other categories, that's enough for now to make that point. So that's why philosophy is so tremendously important. As it concerns logic, the question I just mentioned, how should we think the correct way to think? Logic, the study of sound inference, logically sound inference, reliable patterns of inference, and also studying unreliable patterns of inference, identifying that are committed when we try to make our inferences our reasons. And so as it concerns debate, obviously logic is part and parcel to debate, because without logic itself, you couldn't think whatsoever, let alone make an argument trying to prove or falsify anything. So with that being said, the point of debate is not just to bicker, because usually debate is just said in the sense of just verbal combat, just verbal strife. No, debate has been slandered. If you know what debate is and you do it correctly, it should be, at the very least, edifying and informative, even if the most optimal result doesn't come about, which is everyone coming to an agreement and learning better and adhering to the truth that was just ascertained after the debate. So what you have is a procedure of an exchange of arguments. A procedure of exchange of arguments. At best, all persons involved, the interlocutors, are giving at least valid arguments, at most or at best, sound arguments, and then everyone accepting, acknowledging, and adhering to the truth that was just articulated. What's the difference? A valid argument is where the conclusion follows from the premises. Whether the premises are true or false, the conclusion follows from the premises. They connect, they jive. An invalid argument is when an argument has premises that don't flow together, they don't jive. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises.
Hey, Gregory, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there something
And
you could
logic
do
is
to try and adjust your mic again? It's coming in a little broken.
okay. Let me move spots. Kind of ghetto, but you know it is what it is. Do I sound better? Does it clear?
We can hear background noise from it now, though.
There's the background noise. I moved away from them. Is it clear now?
Yep. Yeah.
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so y'all heard valid and invalid arguments, right? What that is?
Yeah. So you can have a valid argument, but your premise is incorrect or whatever. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, a valid argument, whether the premises are true or false, the premises connect, they jive, the conclusion follows from the premises. But of course, in the first place, kind of saying this out of order, an argument in the first place is one or more supporting premises supporting a concluding premise. The argument subsists of supporting premises and the concluding premise. You have to have at least one supporting premise, if not more, so that you have something to appeal to indicate your concluding premise is correct, is true. So you have a valid argument, you have an invalid argument, preferably a valid argument if you're trying to actually convey that you know what you're talking about. And then lastly, and most of all, a sound argument. The premises are all true and the form thereof is valid. The premises are all true and the form is valid. Then one asks the question, how do you know you have a valid argument? Right. So then you think through, this is the area of knowledge where you really do have to think through. Now, that doesn't necessarily entail that everyone's going to come to the same conclusion, because we all make decisions. We decide that we're going to believe this or that or whatever would have you. But regardless of whatever we decide, disagreement doesn't entail that knowledge is not possible, including about logic. So there's that. And I have to mention that because so often in philosophical discourse, what seems to be an insurmountable obstacle that is someone else's devotion to whatever given idea and the refusal to concede, even in the face of the most powerful and rigorous sound argumentation, some people make the fallacious inference, the invalid inference that if there's disagreement, and especially if there's persistent disagreement, then no one knows anything. Well, that's not the case. You can persistently disagree and knowledge still be possible. And or the given person who made a logically sound argument still know what they're talking about in spite of the persistent disagreement by the other persons involved. So we really have to take it upon ourselves to critically consider what is being said by the other person and scrutinize ourselves. It's very important. That's the ethical aspect as it concerns the debate. So like I mentioned earlier, when you're debating, at best, as we should, be practicing all piety and virtue, which includes critical consideration and self-scrutiny. Now, why do I say the first part like that, critical consideration? Because we can be critical, but not considerate. Right? We can have all the critiques in the world, but refuse to allow the other person that we're talking about, to have a chance to be right. We refuse to let them even to acknowledge and say in our mind, perhaps they are right. Let me hear them out, and let me hear them out thoroughly. Right, so that's the critical aspect. Excuse me, that's the considerate aspect. You can be critical, but without being considerate, and you can be considerate without being critical. That's called gullibility, or naivety, or naivete, right? Or just credulity, just credulous. You just believe. You don't have a reason. You didn't think it through. You can't even recall what persuaded you or convinced you. You just do. You just do believe. Right? So you can be credulous, you can be critical, but it's best to be both simultaneously. And by the Lord's grace, it does take wisdom to strike that balance with both of them. And then the other virtue I mentioned, which is self-scrutiny, because you can be scrutinizing others when you're critically considerate. That's fine, but usually people fail to strike that balance between criticism and consideration to be critically considerate because they're not being self-scrutinizing. They're not scrutinizing themselves. They're not examining, analyzing themselves. And sometimes even when they are examining or analyzing themselves, they're not examining, analyzing themselves the same way they do others. They may raise the bar higher for themselves than they scrutinize others, which usually is good, but sometimes is too rigorous to a fault. You're being hypercritical. Now you're no longer being considerate towards yourself in that instance, being hypercritical towards yourself. Or you raise the bar lower for yourself than you scrutinize everyone else. You scrutinize everyone else more rigorously than you scrutinize yourself. So you're either assaulting yourself, being hypercritical towards yourself, and not being equally scrutinizing or critical towards others, or you're being unjust towards others in hypocrisy, where you don't scrutinize others with the same rigor, you don't scrutinize yourself with the same degree of rigor, you scrutinize others. So you want to be equitable and consistent in your scrutiny of yourself and whoever else. And of course, you want to have the appropriate criterion of verification of scrutiny when you do scrutinize everyone, because not every premise, not every proposition is verified in the exact same way. There isn't one type of argument for all ideas whatsoever. So what do I talk about so far? An argument is a series of premises to prove a conclusion. There are various types of arguments: deductive arguments, inductive arguments, and abductive arguments. That's usually how any given logician is going to break that down to you. Now, if you dig deep enough, you're going to find all sorts of wacky idiosyncrasies and nuances that are very niche and arcane and just not at all well known or even intuitive. You know, those various types of arguments. You have valid arguments, you have invalid arguments. Valid argument, the premises connect together, and which includes the concluding premise following from the supporting premises. The opposite of that, an invalid argument. They don't jive together. The premises don't connect. And then at best of all, you have a logically sound argument. The premises are all true, and it's in a valid form. The premises connect. The conclusion follows from the supporting premises. So while we debate, trying to appreciate these concepts, you are listening with thorough critical consideration to the opponent, being critical and considerate. You are also scrutinizing yourself perpetually at all times, most of all, not just during debate, but at all times whatsoever. Because if you don't, you will very likely fail to strike the balance between criticism and consideration, excuse me. Now, that's the best behavior when debating. Not everyone decides to do that. What people sometimes decide to do, you either are logically sound or you're not logically sound. Right? Your argument is invalid, or it is valid, but the premises are false. But some people do this not as a sincere error, but deliberately. Now, why would you deliberately commit an error? Because not everyone is genuinely trying to seek the truth, unfortunately. Or they're not trying to convey the truth either, even if they do know the truth. What they do is they deliberately use fallacious replies, fallacious arguments. Sometimes they're very sophisticated sounding, or sometimes they just sound like informal common vernacular. Or the behavior is just not consistent with what is being asserted. That too. And sophistry is basically a combination of both. It is deliberately using fallacious argumentation in your practice of debate. So that's a very good danger, very good danger. That's a very terrible danger, very terrible hazard, especially when debating cosmology. So how do you address that? How do we handle that hazard when we come across it? Well, this is where you make the decision to dig in your heels and do the work. You have to, all the more, because this interlocutor who is a sophist is not going to cooperate with you or be helpful to you. What they're going to do is they're going to try to trick you, try to deceive you, try to mislead you, they're going to try to make you stumble, make you fail. They want you to fail. They don't want you to understand either, usually. So either they want you to understand, they want you to believe an error, or they don't want to make you understand. They want to confuse you. One or two approaches in sophistry. So when you come across them, you all the more practice the same thing I just mentioned earlier. You're still critically considerate, and you're all the more critical, especially once you recognize them to be a sophist. But you have to listen thoroughly in order to eventually recognize them, in order for you to discern that they are a sophist. Once you do, you intensify all the more your criticism and your critical consideration. And you still perpetually optimize your self-scrutiny, because you don't want to fall into this trap where you become indignant against the sophist, but now in your effort to destroy them or to refute them, you're getting caught up in your emotions, and now you find yourself, unbeknownst to you, while you're completely oblivious, you're committing the very same vices and the very same errors that they are. Self-scrutiny is just unnegligible. Now, also, when you're debating, it not only is fine for you to explicitly concede that you don't understand what was being talked about. That's fine, because that's actually helpful, right? So the opponent says something you don't understand or you're not familiar with. Go ahead and say, I don't recognize that. I don't know what you're talking about. Please explain that. Now, of course, some people do this disingenuously with a vicious or vindictive attitude. Preferably not do that, because the more we perpetuate a vindictive approach, an adversarial approach, it's just going to intensify one another's vindictiveness and contempt, and we're increasing the likelihood of committing these fallacies and or these vices, and now we're decreasing the quality of the debate. It's just a detriment to everyone involved. So when you're engaging a sophist, by the way, sophism comes from the Greek word sophia, meaning wisdom. However, when you go back to the pre-Socratics, which is the 6th century BC and up to late antiquity, 1st century AD to 6th century AD, the pre-Socratics, a faction of them called the Sophists, they were paid professional rhetoricians and grammarians and logicians, but they affirmed that no one knows anything or no one can know anything. So just use rhetoric, use speech to be as persuasive and convincing as possible to get your way. Now, we recognize that. We recognize that attitude, especially with the so-called lawyers or attorneys. They are the sophists of today. That's one of them like that. Of course, not to slander all lawyers. What I said applies to it, of course. Applies to who it applies to, of course. So that's why that term exists, to identify such a person, because these pre-Socratic Grecian philosophers decided they were going to behave this way, and then they set a precedent. Now we remember them, and now we use that as a term for anyone who behaves like that. So a sophist. So when you approach the sophist, you all the more intensify, concentrate on being critical in your critical consideration and self-scrutiny. so that you eventually identify them to be sophists, so that you then are able to refute the errors that they commit. Once you master, you don't need to be an encyclopedia either to effectively debate. You just need to appreciate these basic concepts and do the appropriate research for whatever subject you're trying to debate, and then you'll be fine. Right? You'll be fine. We'll be fine. So, argument, valid argument, invalid argument, logically sound argument, deductive argument. I didn't explain this yet. I don't need to be long about this. Deductive argument. The conclusion necessarily follows from the supporting premises. The conclusion necessarily follows from the supporting premises. I'm not going to list all of them, but a couple of rules of inference using the Latin terms which logicians have historically used to identify these types, these forms of argument, is modus ponens and modus tollens. What is that? Modus ponens. If A, then B, A, therefore B. Beginning with the conditional premise, then affirming the antecedent in the conditional premise in the second premise, then concluding with the consequent in the conditional premise in the concluding premise. If A, then B, A, therefore B, modus ponens. Modus tollens, very similar, but a subtle difference. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. You negate the consequent in the conditional premise in the second premise, then you negate the antecedent in the conditional premise in the conclusion. Okay, that's modus ponens, a couple of rules of inference. Those are deductive arguments. Inductive arguments, you're appealing to particulars to indicate a generalization. You're appealing to particulars to indicate a generalization. What's an instance of that? Given the number of particular instances that I set the stove to this particular temperature, and then the water boils, therefore, this particular temperature causes water to boil. I appeal to particular instances to then generalize to a general idea or general conclusion. This temperature causes this water to boil. Okay. Or given the amount of times the criminal has committed theft, they are a habitual repeat offender committing theft, burglary. They're very likely to commit that crime, given the numerous previous instances that they've committed that crime. That's another inductive inference. Abductive is very similar to inductive, but it's not trying to generalize from particulars like induction. It's trying to convey this is the most plausible. This is the most plausible conclusion out of all the other conclusions. Out of all the other conclusions, this is most plausible. So an example of that would be, given the errors in all the other theories, I'm being very vague in general for deliberately, because I don't want to get bogged down into particular. Given the errors of all these other theories to explain the observed phenomena, except this one, therefore this one is the most plausible account or explanation for the given phenomenon. Not really arguing that it's necessarily true or that it's been verified, but it's arguing this is most plausible, this is most convincing, this is most persuasive. Okay, so inductive, abductive, I'm misspeaking, deductive, inductive, abductive argument. And abductive is really tricky. That's the abductive argument is usually where you get to see the irritation of all the disagreement that we always talk, that we usually get irritated with. So besides that, argument, logically sound argument, valid argument, invalid argument, deductive argument, inductive argument, abductive argument, fallacies, formal fallacies or informal fallacies. Formal fallacies
is when, for instance, you have a formal fallacy is an instance of committing an invalid argument. There's an error in the form. An example of that is affirming the consequent. I told you modus ponens, a deductive argument. If A, then B, A, therefore B. A formal fallacy, when you use that form, is when you go, if A, then B, B, therefore A. It's called affirming the consequent. In the conditional premise, you have the antecedent and the consequent. The antecedent, the if part, the consequent, the then part. When I committed the fallacy of affirming the consequent, I affirmed the then in the second premise after I presented the conditional premise, the first premise. If A, then B, B, therefore A, rather than if A, then B, A, therefore B. Okay. So that's affirming the consequent. That's a type of formal fallacy. An informal fallacy is not an error in the form of argument, but it's just an appeal to a premise that is not reliably indicative of the conclusion being true. So I'm debating someone. They say a premise that may or may not be true, for all I know. But what I appeal to try and refute them is they are condescending. So given that they're condescending, their argument is fallacious or the conclusion is false. Well, that doesn't follow. That's called ad hominem, which is the Latin phrase for against the man. Against the man. I attack the character of the person in my attempt to refute their argument, even though no matter how deplorable and reprehensible their behavior is, it has nothing to do with the conclusion of the premise. It's irrelevant. Their argument could be valid and or logically sound whilst being a reprehensible person. So that's an informal fallacy as opposed to a formal fallacy. So there's that too. So again, the conclusion out of all this is, do you know your beliefs are true? Do we know our beliefs are true? The whole point of logic is to know that you are thinking correctly, that you are making correct patterns of inference so that you can ascertain knowledge. So when we have especially the disagreements about the most profound issues, whether it be a cosmology or more importantly, notice my emphasis, no, more importantly, ethics, how we ought to behave or how we ought not behave, et cetera, very important to know what you're talking about and be able to say, to present, to show that you know what you're talking about. It's very important, very important. All the conflict in the world, even the most heinous and heart-wrenching, agonizing conflict that we experience is because someone is committing an error in their thinking, and then they behave accordingly. They've committed an error in their thinking and then behave according to it. Now, if you believe what you believe, especially as it concerns ethics, how we ought to behave and we ought not to behave, what is permissible, et cetera, you should know. You should know. We should know. I cannot emphasize that enough, because this is what makes the whole subject worthy. Right? We practice logically sound thinking. We don't just say logically sound arguments, we practice logically sound thinking. When you debate, like I just mentioned earlier, that is a practice, at best, of logically sound thinking. So logic is very much concerned with our everyday lives, even the most intimate behaviors that we all participate in. If you're not logically sound, you're not necessarily going to do something that's severely detrimental, but you're increasing the likelihood. And you commit enough errors all put together, you're going to suffer the repercussions. We will suffer the repercussions, not just against you, but against other persons. The more we think logically sound, the better we will behave, the better our society will become. I think that's all.
Damn.
That's awesome, man.
Dude, what a great breakdown and introduction into it. There was some terminology that you were introducing at the beginning that I took some notes on, but then you ended up defining it later on throughout the talk. So that was awesome. And then you gave examples
I
for
wanted
each
to ask
one
if you
too.
could
So
define.
the
I was
abductive
gonna ask
reasoning
if
one,
you could
or
define. Oh, sorry.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if you could define inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning, and then he did. So then I took that question off my list. But I have a
Yep.
bunch of questions for Q&A. You answered a couple of
I'm
them
glad I was able to
during
do that.
the presentation, man. That was awesome.
I'm glad I did that. Thank you for that feedback.
Thank you.
Now, I do also want to give you insight into my heart. I am self-aware. I'm not infallible. I'm not perfect, but I am self-aware to the degree that I recognize that anyone who goes out of their way to, especially to speak publicly about these ideas, these concepts, this knowledge, especially about philosophical things, it inevitably puts us in a position in the perception of whatever given audience, however big or small, where, especially among the cynical people in the audience, who may or may not be cynical with or without a justification. Usually they have a justification to be cynical because they've had a whole anecdote in their lives where many of the persons, the majority of the persons, especially the most important person in their lives, have more so wronged them than done good to them. So they're going to make the inductive inference, see how it's relevant to behavior? They're going to make the inductive inference that, especially someone who sounds articulate like this, but has also demonstrated duplicity and deceit and betrayal, treachery, fraudulent antics, et cetera, now they're going to make the inductive inference, okay, it's another one of these uppity, deceitful bastards, that kind of attitude. That's a justification. Now, they could be wrong about whatever given person. I argue they would be wrong about me. But I would empathize and have mercy and grace for that type of person, as in contrast to the person who doesn't have any reason like that. There's nothing in their thinking that is informing them deductively, inductively, or abductively in any type of argument that is indicative of me being guilty of any type of vice, especially the more heinous vices. Like that person would be out without justification. But the reason I'm saying this now is because the persons who are able to know these things, comprehend these things, articulate these things, you would think, and rightfully so, then they should be practicing this, right? They should be consistently practicing this. Why the hell are they committing such an error like this when they know so much about these subjects, these philosophical subjects, and yada, 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 especially about logic? How is he knowing so much about logic, but he's committing such a flagrant fallacy in this instance or that instance? How is he so informative, knowledgeable about ethics, but he's committing such flagrant hypocrisy in this or that instance, et cetera, et cetera? So what's the point? My point is that people like this are at a greater risk of setting themselves up to be seen as disingenuous and or dishonest hypocrites. Now, at best, the audience is logically sound and pious in their thinking. They're charitable. Right? They go out of the way to make the best possible interpretation rather than the worst or less than the best interpretation of what was said or what was done. They're patient, they're merciful, they're gracious, et cetera, at best. And of course, if you're worse than the best, then that's no good, especially if you're the worst. So that's what you hope the audience will do, but very often that's not what happens in this world, in its present state. Very often, the philosophers, even the most deplorable philosophers, are mistreated by the audience because just for simply saying something that the audience doesn't understand, in human depravity and frailty, we react with animosity. We react with contempt or disdain or aversion. And then you start mistreating the person. Just because they said something you don't understand, just because they seem to be far more intellectually superior than you, well, how far you know, they're really not that far above you, like inches above you, not miles above you. Just ask a question. Just seek to understand, which is exactly why King Solomon said what he said at the beginning of the Proverbs. Get understanding, and all you're getting, get understanding. He who answers a matter before he hears the entirety thereof, that's his folly and shame. Archaic English, that's his foolishness and shame. Be ashamed. It's reprehensible. So I'm aware that if I get up and speak in front of any audience, no matter how big or small, I'm at risk. I'm at risk. But the risk is worth the reward. The risk is indeed worth the reward. I'd rather risk the disfavorable perception and or reaction of a given audience in my attempt to edify them. Because if I'm edifying them, like I just said, the more logically sound we think, the better we know, the more likely we are, notice my emphasis, the more likely we are to behave better. Now, why did I not say the more we know, the better our behavior will become? Because in human depravity and frailty, sometimes we defy what we know. Sometimes we defy what we know. We know better and refuse to do better because we want to do the thing that we know we ought not do, or we refuse to do the thing we know we should do. Sometimes when I say these things, I sting myself, so bear with me. So I'm aware of that too. So whoever you're talking to, that's why I keep emphasizing those two virtues, critical consideration and self-scrutiny. Self-scrutiny, of course, is going to require you to be self-aware. You got to at least be aware of what you are and what state you're in before you can actually scrutinize it to be just or unjust, good or not good, beneficial, detrimental, whatever would happen. So there's that too.
Dude, fantastic breakdown. And I really like the part about it being edifying for the audience rather than for yourself. Because if it's not edifying if the audience can't walk away with anything, then you actually accomplish nothing. And I've been guilty of that where I was like, I need some personal edification right now. And I just need to slay. And yeah, it is like obviously not gratifying if nobody understood like the impact of what happened. And yeah, like reining that in is very important. I completely agree with that. And self-scrutiny and self-consideration are highly important in that.
Critical consideration.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Critical consideration. Thank you. Are extremely important, and not going like you could tell the difference in when you watch people that debate, like who actually is doing that, who's like presently aware of like logic fallacies versus like trying to win through obfuscation. Like you were saying earlier, like a sophist isn't going to give you any headway or do anything to make anything edifying for anyone because their entire job.
Heads up, I'm going to commit this error. I'm trying to deceive you. That's not going to do it.
No. So, yeah, going through that and understanding it is extremely, extremely important.
I like how you cited Proverbs 18:13. Benjamin and I were actually talking about that 2 days ago. I actually tweeted about that towards Austin, about this current speculation thing. That was a bit of a synchronicity there.
And all you're getting, get understanding. We all are trying to get something. Wisdom the Lord gave King Solomon is that whatsoever you're trying to get, priority number one is to get understanding. And of course, the most important understanding, like he wrote in the scroll of the teacher, Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, the whole conclusion of the matter is this: fear the God and obey his commandments. For this is what it means to be human. This is the whole duty of humankind.
Do you have any other topics that you want to cover, or do you want to go into Q&A?
Yeah, Q&A. Let's go.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Because I have a bunch.
Fire away.
All right. So I'll start with like the really easy ones. Can there be a sound argument that is not falsifiable?
Can there be a sound argument that is not falsifiable? In one sense, yes. In another sense, no. In the first sense, when I say yes, if you have a logically sound argument about a state of affairs that is mutable, meaning it can change, then that argument is no longer going to correspond to the given state of affairs because the state of affairs has changed. For example, I can make the inductive, the very strong. I should have mentioned that also. When you make an inductive argument, it's weak or strong. It's weak or strong. Deductive argument, you have the conclusion necessitating the truthfulness of the supporting premises necessitating the truthfulness of the conclusion. Okay. With a inductive argument, it doesn't necessitate the conclusion to be true. It'll weakly or strongly indicate the conclusion to be true. So, for instance, like in my example, right now, given that I see the tree devoid of leaves, therefore the tree is devoid of leaves. That's not going to remain true if the uniformity of nature continues as it normally does, where new leaves grow on the branches. So if I repeat that argument, looking at the tree with the leaves, not without the leaves, it's not going to be true. It'll be a valid inference in principle that if I did indeed empirically detect the tree being devoid of leaves, and that I conclude the tree is devoid of leaves, that's a valid inference. But when you scrutinize the first premise in my argument, it's obviously empirically inadequate and falsified given the presence of the leaves now. So that's an instance where a logically sound argument is no longer sound in the sense that the premise no longer corresponds to the current state of affairs because the state of affairs has changed. Now, of course, so long as the state of affairs actually corresponds to the given premises, they're going to remain true. It's going to be empirically accurate. For instance, when if I'm trying to make an inductive argument, trying to get empirical knowledge.
So if a variable is introduced, then a sound argument could become an unsound or invalid argument. Because
in the sense that, because it's not as though the sound argument is not sound. That'd be a contradiction. It's either sound or not. The sound argument was true for the time, for the duration of the state of affairs, for instance.
Right.
Now that the state of affairs has changed, if I represent those premises again, it won't be a sound argument in the instance where the state of affairs has now changed.
So I've heard the term logical argument. I've always considered it redundant because I've always thought that an argument has to be logical. Do you think that an argument that doesn't use logic can be considered valid, or rather, can there be an argument that doesn't use logic?
To be strictly consistent with the concept I laid out, there's no such thing as an argument that doesn't use logic.
So therefore,
because an
logical argument is redundant? You consider it redundant?
Depending in which sense you're saying the word logically or logical when you say that phrase. Again, this is me being strict and analytical. There's a tradition in philosophy that's called analytic philosophy. Now, I make no pretense at all that I'm a university attender, let alone graduate, let alone paid professional. I'm just a man. So I just want to make that clear explicitly. That wasn't clear already to anyone who ever hears me speaking, now or whenever they listen to the recording. So if you say that phrase, you can say that you can say that in the sense of it's logically sound, right? It's logically sound, or it's been articulated discursively. What do you mean discursively? Meaning this premise, this premise, this premise, this premise, this premise, conclusion. You're self-consciously thinking through, rigorously thinking through your line of reasoning, discursive reasoning. Usually people don't think that way. It's just habitual or instinctual, or you're just oblivious. You're just reacting. Now, of course, you can't always do a discursive line of thinking in all instances. Sometimes you have to make split-second decisions. So there's that too. So as it concerns your question with logical argument, it can be redundant if you have this idea that there's an argument that doesn't use logic. That's not possible. Argument in and of its nature is utilizing some pattern of inference. You're at least appealing to one premise, if not more, to indicate whatever given conclusion is true. Now, of course, you can appeal to the one premise that is the conclusion itself, which is called begging the question. That's a fallacy.
Right. My next question would be, does the framework of an argument matter? In other words, do you need to establish whether it's a spiritual, scientific, religion, opinion-based? Do you need to establish that like framework of an argument before having an argument with someone? And what happens if you don't? Sort of, baseline stuff.
Need to, for the particular end of making the nature of your argument as easily understandable and conspicuous as possible, sure. You want to articulate as much relevant information as possible because you still want to be concise, you still want to be succinct, because the more the words, the less the meaning, and who does that profit? Again, that's King Solomon, Ecclesiastes. So you still want to be succinct and concise. But yes, it would help. It would help to help the audience, and even help yourself, try to consistently distinguish between the various types of ideas you're trying to attain knowledge about and or edify someone else about. So it's also a worthwhile studying onomastics. What the hell is that? Onomastics, or onomatology, the study of names. The study of names. Why is that important? One of the laws of logic, I should have mentioned this earlier. One of the laws of logic is the law of identity, which is usually articulated as A equals A, if they want to use logical notation, which I am not at all a master of, at least in my eyes. I do not have a very strong grasp of logical notation yet. God willing, I will soon or later. A is A. Right? Which is simply to convey the referent is identical to itself. The referent is identical to itself. Right? It is what it is. We all understand this. Sometimes we just get intimidated or irritated or confused by our more sophisticated rhetoric, but we all know what that means. It is what it is. It ain't what it ain't.
Right.
A is
cannot
A.
be not A.
Right? A is A. A is not A.
Right.
Or non-A. Why am I talking about that? Because when we use the names, we are identifying the given reference. What are you talking about? For instance, someone says to me, what are you talking about? What the natural reply we're going to say is, we're going to identify the thing that we're talking about. I'm talking about, fill in the blank, I'm talking about logic, I'm talking about valid argumentation, I'm talking about fallacies, etc., etc. We need names in order to identify anything. We need names in order to identify anything. So when you are trying to categorize various things, you have to, of course, you need a moniker, you need a name to identify it. So you then can speak whatever language to identify it. So I'm not at all against labels. To be against labels, to be against names, is to defy the law of identity. And to defy the law of identity is to make it impossible to identify anything so that you can know anything about anything. That's ridiculous.
That's why equivocation is such a problem. You establish a framework, you establish certain shared definitions for words, colloquiality. So like if I mean, this is a silly one, but if I say that there's something that is massless matter, right? Well, then we need to know what mass means. We need to know what matter means. You know what I mean?
Indeed.
You can't have those. That's why law of identity is why equivocation is such a problem.
Indeed.
And there's the law of excluded middle and the law of, there's the third one. It's escaping me right now.
Law of non-contradiction.
Right, correct.
Right. Now, I'm glad you mentioned it.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's all you.
I'm glad you mentioned equivocation. You have equivocation, equal vocal, equal voice. Right? One word, two different senses. You're saying one word, the vocal part, in two different senses. So you're equivocating the word in two different senses, rather than consistently using the word in one given sense in a particular instance that you're trying to convey whatever you're trying to convey. That isn't to say that you can never say a given word in another sense. That's ridiculous. That is, but that is to say that if you say a given word in two or more senses simultaneously, you increase the likelihood of misinterpretation, where the person is not even going to make sense out of what you said at all, or they're going to misinterpret, grasping the wrong sense besides what you meant. Or you did mean both simultaneously, and you're just being inconsistent, contradicting yourself. And now what you're doing is you're defying the law of identity again. You're either referring to A or not A and not A simultaneously. We're talking about this, not that, and we can't talk about multiple subjects simultaneously. Can only talk about one thing at a time.
And I do think that people will use that tactically. I think it's one of the harder ones to use, like, consciously and tactically, equivocation, because it's like using the word sun in different ways. But I brought massless matter. I think you know why, because I think we all remember the massless matter thing.
Mm-hmm.
This one is directly related to one of your main points. How do you think it's best to strengthen self-scrutiny and critical consideration to reach a balance between considerate scrutiny, as you called it? Having an equal amount of scrutiny towards your own argument and another argument, in others' argument.
The God is the provider to everyone for everything, which includes our nature, which includes liberation from our inclination to error. Now, in the Lord's providence, whether it be to his children regenerated by his Holy Spirit, or to those who are not, he has given idiosyncrasies to every given person. I began there because you can only voluntarily behave according to your nature. That is absolutely true about every given entity, every given person, human or non-human, every animal, every living entity, human or non-human. You behave according to your nature, even voluntarily behaving according to your nature. Some people are so severe that they just refuse. They just defy virtue, as it seems. Some people are better, relatively, but all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. First and foremost, the Lord's providence, what decides the difference. Now, of course, what we do is we decide, what we can do voluntarily is we decide that we are going to attempt to attain knowledge of piety and virtue, ethics, knowledge of piety and ethics, which includes right thinking, because everything we do with our muscles, every voluntary act we do with our muscles, every voluntary act, I got to emphasize, some people might mishear, every voluntary act we do with our muscles is consequential to our thinking. Right? We moved our muscle because we thought the thought, we intended to do it, and we attempted to do it, voluntarily moving our muscles. I'm walking back and forth voluntarily. I'm moving my mouth and my tongue voluntarily, vibrating my vocal folds voluntarily, so that I can convey information voluntarily. You get the point. So as soon as we decide that we are going to attain knowledge of especially right behavior, and then we decide that we're going to persevere to practice it, even in spite of our inclination to sins, to vices, that then will be the instance we start improving our behavior. We start and then we continue to practice piety. You got to make the decision.
That is perfect to lead into my next question. So during a debate, someone's claim to me was, I don't believe anything. I don't have beliefs. Well, how do you know that, right? Basically, I
Mm-hmm.
understood belief as the necessitation for any type of knowledge, because you first need to believe that reality exists outside of yourself to know anything at all, right? So do you
Indeed.
think that belief necessitates knowledge?
I think you mean, is belief necessary to know? If you meant that, then yes.
Correct.
If you meant what you said, then no, because believing something doesn't necessarily instantiate or indicate that you do know the belief is true. You can believe something and not know it to be true. But as it concerns the first reiteration, because I think that was my charitable interpretation of the question, of course, is belief necessary to attain knowledge? Yes. Because the whole point of asking the question, how do you know, is concerning the given predication, the supposition, the proposition, they're all synonymous in the context of which I'm using the word. The given premise that you assert it as though it is true. You predicated it. This is true, this is false, whatever have you. This is true. Okay, how do you know? Obviously, you believe, you affirm or assent that this proposition is true, that it is veracious, that it possesses veracity, right? How do you know? That question is asking for a reason to justify, to support, to indicate the given predication, the premise is indeed true. So that's the whole point of asking, how do you know? Because we're asking the person who believes the given predication they asserted to demonstrate it to be veracious, to demonstrate it to be true. Now, if you say you don't believe it, then what are we talking about then? Why are you talking as though you know what you're talking about when you don't even believe the premise to be true? You don't even affirm the premise to be true. So how could you then say you know it to be true? To say that you don't believe the premise, but you know the premise is true, is to patently contradict yourself. Because what that conveys is, I don't even affirm or assent that the proposition is indeed true, and I have a justification to indicate that it indeed is true. What are you justifying? You don't have a premise that you affirm to be true.
Right. That's perfect. More easy one. What books and or resources can you recommend to a newbie who is looking into logic?
All things philosophy, including logic, you can go to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, academic peer review. You can go to stanford.edu, plato.stanford.edu. You can go to, oh my God, what's the name? My hands are freezing right now. I don't feel like probably scrolling through my phone. It's, no, I'm going to scroll through anyway. I at least want to mention three. Hold on. Tapping my screen.
Is it
Tap,
the
tap,
Internet
tap.
Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Propositional Logic, Potential Logic? You sent that to me once.
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome.
Here's another one. Philpapers.org. Philpapers.org. It's the abbreviation of philosophy. Philpapers.org. So there's three right there.
Got it. If you're getting like cold or out of gas, I have more questions, but like if you don't have time or whatever, if you're getting cold, I don't want to keep you outside.
No, you're good. A book that is good. A good book. I haven't read a lot of books in print, holding it in my hand, but I have listened to audiobooks. I don't know why I had a brain fart there. The History of Western Philosophy and Theology by Dr. John Brown. That's a good one. The History of Western Philosophy and Theology. Now, we discussed logic. The way I've learned philosophy is through a historical analysis. And I believe there's just no better way to study it, because when you either are studying the historical evolution of the ideas so that you then see the connection from era to era, generation to generation, and you see how these ideas respond and or how they spawned and or flowed from a preceding school of thought. So you see the connection in the world, in human behavior, in the history of the pattern of events, rather than just these principial ideas. Now, both are just fine, but you might as well just grasp the history of events, the past events, and how these ideas evolved or developed or spawned, so that you then appreciate the principles that are being conveyed. It's really amazing. It's really amazing. I listened to Dr. Arthur Holmes. Dr. Arthur Holmes. He's on YouTube. And of course, I'm sure you can find his books. I've listened to Dr. Cornelius Van Til. I've listened to, like I just mentioned, Dr. John Frame. I've listened to Dr. Greg L. Bonson, rest his soul. I'm aware of, I can't really say I've listened to him, I'm aware of Dr. Oliphant, I forget his first name. I've listened to Dr. Ravi Zacharias. I've listened to many of these persons. Of course, they have been around. Dr. Bonson, he died in his early 40s, so he was around since he was around since this. He was born in, I can't do math, the 50s. But the other doctors I mentioned, especially Dr. Frame, he's the oldest one. I think he's in his 80s or 90s.
How do you spell his last name? Is it Fring?
Dr. Frame?
Oh, Frame. Frame.
Yeah.
So out of the list, I got Dr. Arthur Holmes, Cornelius Van Til, V-A-N-T-A.
Van Til, yeah, VAN space TIL.
TIL. Greg L. Bonson.
Dr. Greg L. Bonson, yeah.
L. Bonson, got it.
Bonson is BAHNSEN.
Got it. And then Dr. Olive Bond? I couldn't really hear on
Yeah,
that
OLIPHANT. Oliphant.
NT. And then Dr. Robbie Zacharias for the
Yes.
5. And Dr. John Frame. Awesome.
Right. So I've listened to them. They've authored plenty of books. I just don't have a whole lot of books because they cost money. But the Lord willing, I'll get more sooner rather than later. So those are some persons that I've listened to. They have their accolades, they have their accomplishments, and their legacy that they left behind. So yeah.
Awesome, man. I wrote all those down. I'm probably gonna get my hands on a bunch of those books. I'm a bit of a book hoarder. You mentioned affirming the consequent. What is your go-to example of someone affirming the consequent? What would you go to explain that to someone who doesn't know what it is?
Especially nowadays with the cosmological controversy, as I call it, because it's a controversy about cosmology, so I think the name's rather appropriate. The Glober, so-called, what they will do usually, to my surprise, when I first began participating in the discussion, you would think they would just make haste to appealing to observations of the Earth, not everything else but that's what they've done. And a part of their appeal to everything else but, usually appealing to phenomena in the air or in the sky, what they will basically do, even if you make the most uncharitable reiteration of their argument, what they'll do is they'll make some inductive appeal. At best, usually don't realize that it is an inductive appeal. They'll make the inductive appeal to some phenomena in the sky, like the celestial bodies, and then conclude that indicates the Earth is a ball. So if the sun sets, the Earth is a ball, then the Earth is a ball. The Earth is a ball, therefore the sun sets. Right, that's affirming the consequent. The conditional premise. If the sun sets, antecedent, then the Earth is a ball, a spheroid, consequent in the conditional premise. Next, they affirm the consequent. The Earth is a ball, conclusion, affirming the antecedent. Therefore, the sun sets. That's affirming the consequent. And the further critique to say that is, you can have a sunset, you can see the sunset on a horizontal surface. Possible to see the sunset on a horizontal surface. So to try and make that inductive appeal as though that is exclusive to a horizontal surface, out of the two options of any given surface being curved or not, and if not, then horizontal, you're making this weak inductive appeal affirming the consequent in your deductive argument. And they don't even think that well through it. I've never heard them say, rarely do they ever say, this is my inductive argument, this is my deductive argument. Once you once you become adept, because that master's too much. Once you become adept at these concepts, then you can phrase their arguments better than them. It's called steel man, in the most best way possible, and then you can recognize the error. Because again, a person who's not adept can either commit a sincere error or a sophistic insincere error. Of course, the latter is worse, especially when the latter is when you're engaging the sophist. You're gonna want to be able to formulate their arguments or to make their argument clear, because they're not going to make it clear. Part of sophistry is to obscure or to obfuscate, not to clarify. Part and parcel, sophistry, to obscure rather than clarify. So your rule of inference is helpful to try and clarify what their argument is. Now, of course, they're very likely to just move the goalpost because they are trying to obscure, they're trying to confuse, they don't want you to clarify, they don't want their position to be clear. Okay? It's like a sniper. It's analogous to a sniper, hiding in the bushes. They don't want their position to be revealed. It's easy to throw stones from a concealed position. I digress, though. So, as concerns affirming the consequent, you are affirming the consequent in the conditional premise, and then concluding with the antecedent, rather than the other way around. Affirming the antecedent in the succeeding premise after the conditional premise, and then concluding with the consequent, which that would be modal opponents, rather than affirming the consequent topic.
Right, this would be a violation of modus ponens. This is if B then A, right? Essentially.
If A then B, B therefore A. Affirming
Yeah, B therefore A, correct. Same question. Best or go-to example of special pleading.
Special pleading is when you have an absolute principle that doesn't have exceptions, but then after you establish that premise, you then give an exception to something else when you already previously established that there's no exception to the initial principle. Sounds complicated, but it's like this. If I say everyone dies, period, no qualification, just straightforward, simple predication, everyone dies. But then I follow up saying, except this person. I've now special pleaded. Now, especially I've special pleaded if I don't have any sufficient reason to say that this person is exempt or that principle doesn't apply to them. So to special plead is when you have an absolute principle with no exception initially established, and then you predicate that there is an exception without any sufficient reason, without any justification. Now, if I have a justification, then that's different, because the principle doesn't apply to such a given person. Things apply to what they apply to, and they don't apply to what they don't apply to. Well, duh, Gregory, why did you say that? It's called a tautology. Now, sometimes tautologies are just redundant and annoying, but sometimes tautologies are, again, good clarifying rhetoric. Because there are plenty of things that we understand and we say them tautologically, but we just don't appreciate, we don't thoroughly grasp them. And so because we don't thoroughly grasp them, we're not in the habit of clearly and thoroughly appreciating these very simple things that we usually take for granted and obviously understand. So it's just a self-conscious, deliberate effort to clarify and thoroughly grasp something, whatever given premise, so that you don't miss it in any given particular instance. We're just prone and susceptible to being inconsistent sometimes, which is why we have to study logic.
Perfect. And for the most part, I'm happy to get these fleshed out because a lot of people don't know baseline fallacies. Like a lot of people think ad hom means any insult, right?
Uh-huh.
Ad hom could mean, it's an argument that is not an argument, it's an insult rather than an argument.
Right. The ad hominem fallacy, like you just mentioned, it's to criticize or attack the person to prove the given premise is false, not just attack them. Subtle difference, but still significant.
Right, it's in place of, rather than forming an argument, premise.
Yeah, you're appealing to your criticism of the given person to prove their position is false or your position is true, when no reprehensible behavior, no matter how bad the behavior is, The no reprehensible behavior, no matter how bad the character is not going to indicate that the Earth is a ball, or the surface is horizontal, etc., etc. Now, of course, if you are trying to prove that they are guilty of whatever given sin or vice, then that's a different issue.
What do you think a common example of appeal to possibility is? Where do you see that the most? If you
This
do see
happens
it.
all too often.
Yep.
Like with this recent controversy with all the defamation and slander against Austin, um, to put it simply, because usually people don't put it simply, but people are not usually straightforward. Most people are sloppy with their rhetoric. When I say rhetoric, I'm saying that in the sense of their word choice and word order. Word choice and word order. People are sloppy with their rhetoric. And so because people are usually evidently we have this tendency to be sloppy with our rhetoric and still expecting others to interpret us correctly. Well, he could be lying. Period.
Yeah.
As though the very metaphysical truism that he could be lying therefore indicates that he is indeed lying, or that he has indeed lied. And that obviously doesn't follow. Now, what I say to people when they commit these errors is that imagine someone, especially a lawyer, employing that sort of reasoning against you. You would be irate and you would lose all self-discipline. But so why are you doing it to someone else? Knock that off. That's obviously an asinine, ridiculous argument. The possibility of something being the case does not indicate that it indeed is the case.
Funnily enough, you knocked off one of my questions by saying that because you said that doesn't follow or that doesn't track, which is obviously hasty generalization. So yeah, people do pair those two often, right? He could be lying, so therefore he is lying. That's hasty generalization. So that knocks that off my list.
That would be an appeal to possibility. A better example of a hasty generalization is this what? I just use a very classic one. This brown-skinned person, right, stole my watch. Therefore, black people are thieves. No. Very well could be the case that the majority of black people don't steal at all. They behave piously. And that's possible also. And this one person just committed theft, or a minority of them commit theft in a whatever to greater or lesser degree of severity in a pattern of theft. That's a hasty generalization. That particular does not sufficiently indicate that your generalization is indeed strong or true. Hasty generalization.
And that knocks off
Or
stereotype
even just about a
as well.
particular person. Even just about a particular person. This person lied here, therefore they lie almost all the time. That doesn't follow either. It very well could be the case that this is the one and only instance that they ever lied, or this is one of the few instances that they've lied. But all things considered, looking at their entire pattern of behavior throughout their entire life, they're mostly honest. They don't have a pattern, a frequent pattern of lying. There's another way to articulate that. Another hasty generalization about a particular person.
So that would be a failed inductive argument, like hasty
That'd be a failed induction.
Yeah.
It'd be a failed argument all the way around, whether you want to phrase it inductively, deductively, or abductively.
Favorite example of appeal to incredulity. I hear this. I have a couple, but if you have a good one, what do you think?
I'm not convinced. Just fill in the blank, whatever they're not convinced of. Well, I don't believe you. I'm not convinced. That's not persuasive. As though you not believing is a falsification of my argument.
Which is also a shifting of the burden of proof, right? Like you've got to convince me for your argument to be valid. It's a very strange. That's a strange dynamic.
Or just a bizarre burden that is not at all required for anything.
Yeah.
Right? You just presuming that I am, just presuming that you're going to burden me, that you're going to prescribe me this burden of convincing you, which is obviously an insurmountable thing, whilst I'm not the God.
And when you did hasty generalization, you also covered genetic and stereotype fallacy, which is awesome. I want to get through the most prominent ones that we see, you know, because those are the most important. Obviously, ad hom happens all the time. Appeal to possibility, incredulity happens all the time. Cherry picking, people get this one wrong all of the time, or most of the time.
Mhm.
Best example.
When you are cherry picking, you are looking at the whole data set of whatever, be it a survey or be it whatever information, the body of information you're looking at. You will then select whatever bigger or smaller portion out of that data set, and then you'll present it as comprehensively in its entirety, or for the most part indicative of whatever conclusion you're trying to prove. When all the while what you really did was select a insufficient fraction out of the whole data set that you found it in, ignoring what the rest of the data does indicate with this section that you plucked out. So it's like quote mining. It's similar to quote mining. Quote mining fallacies when you select whatever fraction of whatever was said or written, and then you present it to convey a sense that the initial author or speaker did not intend that fraction of words to convey in the entire message that they initially said. In fact, that fallacy was committed concerning Jaren during this whole TFE, the final experiment debacle. They
Right, I've
quote
seen
mined
that.
a fraction of what he said in his live stream when he said, "Sometimes you're wrong." Clipped that out with a few other words, presented that as though he is conceding being refuted about geodesy. The Earth is not the surface of the Earth is not horizontal, not flat. When that's not what he was conveying when he said that sentence in the context of the whole body of words that he said to convey with his point. What he really meant to convey, according to Austin, as reported to me, he's a good source about it, he was the one who was there, is sometimes you're wrong concerning the 24-hour sun, right? He thought there wasn't a 24-hour sun. He's not conceding that flat Earth has been falsified. He's conceding that his incredulity or his doubt was proven wrong. We obviously saw the 24-hour sun. You know? That's what he meant. That's an instance of quote mine. So there's enough of that.
Yeah, I've seen that one egregiously used against Jaren. There's another clip, but I don't want to get into the mud of like what he said because
Yeah.
more stuff for. But I agree with you in that's a perfect example. Strawman, best example. That's an easy one,
Oh
but
man.
you know.
And my phone is low below 10%, so I think I might have this be the last one because I also got to get there.
Awesome.
But a straw man, I'm sure y'all can grasp the whole point of the logicians choosing that as the moniker for this fallacy, because you're attacking something. It just ain't me. Like, you're supposed to be attacking me. You're attacking this mannequin, this dummy, this imposter, this other thing besides me. The point being is that you're attacking a premise or an argument that is not mine, that I did not say. So in the attempt to refute my argument, we'll call it argument A, you attack argument B, which is not my argument, and then conclude that you refuted my argument. Now you attack the straw man. And so often, when people bother to insist on or persist with straw man arguments, they don't even successfully refute the straw man, which is hilarious. Bad.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. You knocked them all out of the park.
That's always unfortunate when you can't defeat your own straw man that you set up.
Yeah.
Like, damn, you set him up to fail, and you the one that failed. He won.
Yeah. Your straw man beat you. It's hilarious. But yo, Gregory, yeah, I heard you say your phone's dying. I appreciate you doing this Pres Man and going through all this. This turned out to be really great. Tons of information to go over. And just thank you very much for coming through.
My pleasure. Thank you. God bless you all.
You too, man. Thank you so much.
You too, man. You have a good night. I think Liliana said she was going to wrap us up with a coffee ad.
Oh my God. Hey, how's everyone doing? That was very great. Thank you so much for letting this happen. Uh, whoops, you caught me eating a few dried blueberries as I was sipping on some coffee, brushtail coffee, of course. So I should be polite and not talk with the blueberries in my mouth. You caught me completely by surprise. So
I
no, this
see.
brushtail coffee is delicious.
Well, that was just enough advertisement to meet your contract quota, so I can't really follow you, although I am not pleased with the brevity of that ad. We'll let it slide. All right, everyone, thanks for coming out for Aether Roundtable number 65. See you guys next week. Oh, wait, Taylor wanted to chime in here. Sorry, Taylor, you're unmuted now.
No, you're good. Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation. I think knowing fallacies is absolutely crucial.
And
Awesome.
Brushtail taught me how to love.
All right, lads and ladettes. See you guys on what do we got coming up this week? Flat Earth Fridays on Friday, so check us out on that.